Well, it's great to see so many people here, both members of the European Society and members of the general public. About 5 years ago, we held the world's first ever Steady State Economy Conference here in Leeds. How many people were at that conference? Was there anyone? Yeah, a decent number of people. And we had two goals when we held this conference. The first was to raise awareness about the problems associated with economic growth. And the second was to try and identify specific policies for how to achieve a steady state economy within the UK. And we had over 250 economists, scientists, business leaders, NGO members, members of the general public, and so on who attended and contributed at that conference. And the result was a report called Enough is Enough. Now, at this point, I kind of thought I was done with this project. We put the report up on the webpage, and I decided I was going to return to working on my thesis. But the report was downloaded over 25,000 times in the first few months, was featured on Italian television for some reason which still no one understands. And so Rob Dietz and I thought, okay, well, maybe we should continue working on this. And so we took some of the ideas in the report and transformed them into a book, which was also called Enough is Enough. And then Tom Bliss turned these into a short film, which, you guessed it, was also called Enough is Enough. Today, though, I want to talk about something a bit different than the ideas which are in Enough is Enough. I want to talk about 4 topics. And these are jobs, money, progress, and politics. But before I do that, let me just briefly say something about the transformation which is needed in order to achieve a steady state economy. Well, what is a steady state economy? Herman Daly, who developed the idea in the 1970s, he defined it as an economy with a constant population and a constant stock of capital, maintained by a low rate of throughput. That's just materials and energy. And that throughput being within the regenerative and assimilative capacities of the ecosystem. Now, the main thing to notice about this definition is that it's entirely biophysical. There's no mention of GDP in here, or social goals, or political economy, or anything like that. But that doesn't mean that sweeping changes are not needed in order to achieve a steady state economy. And in Enough is Enough, we discussed 7 big changes to the system that we thought were needed for a steady state economy. And it's really only these first 2 that are related to environmental limits. The other 5 on here are really about trying to deal with the social implications of moving towards an economy such as this. Degrowth, on the other hand, is much more political, really, than a steady state economy, that idea. It's a slogan which calls into question the consensus for growth, a missile word which is intended not to be able to be co-opted in the same way that sustainable development has been by the mainstream. And its advocates are quick to point out that degrowth is not to be interpreted as negative growth. It's not about less of the same, but about creating something which is different. Now, there's no real comprehensive definition of degrowth. There's many different ideas about what degrowth is. But from an ecological economics perspective, here's one definition put forward by Francois Schneider and colleagues. And that is that degrowth is an equitable downscaling of production and consumption that increases human well-being and enhances ecological conditions. But degrowth is more than this. It's also a social movement intended to unite academics and activists towards finding simpler ways of living, deeper concepts of democracy, while respecting biophysical limits. Now, if we truly are exceeding planetary boundaries, then degrowth is needed to achieve a steady state economy. At the same time, though, I think it's quite safe to say that achieving a steady state economy may be a necessary but not sufficient condition to achieve what we mean by degrowth. There is more, I think, involved in this definition of degrowth, more in terms of the social aims, the political changes, and so on, than is in the steady state economy, which is really just a biophysical definition for a particular type of economy. Okay, so on to my 4 big topics that I want to talk to you about. The first one is jobs. Now, probably the biggest fear that most people have when they hear no growth is no jobs. And Tim Jackson, he refers to this problem as the dilemma of growth. And if we're going to state this briefly, it's that growth is unsustainable due to rising resource use and environmental damage, but degrowth is unstable because falling consumer demand leads to rising unemployment. Or my particular version is that growth equals jobs plus destroy the planet. No growth equals no jobs plus save the planet. Now, the relationship between growth and the unemployment rate is often referred to as Okun's law, after Arthur Okun, pictured here with his famous pipe. Now, Okun was an economist at the National Bureau of Economic Research in the US, and he estimated in the early 1960s, in this paper, which I challenge you to read the text there, but what he said basically was that a 3% increase in real GDP is associated with a 1% fall in the unemployment rate. So if GDP goes up, unemployment goes down, and vice versa. And we can test this. We can try and see if this still holds. Here are some data for the US, and they show indeed that there's quite a strong relationship between what happens to GDP when GDP changes and what happens to the unemployment rate. And if you trust me here and we do the math and we look at that regression equation, we'll find the same thing that Okun did. If GDP goes up by 3%, then the unemployment rate will fall by 1%. Now, the interesting thing here, though, is that this doesn't really hold in the same way for other countries. So here's the relationship for Japan. And we see that it really doesn't matter what you do to the real GDP rate here. It doesn't have much of an effect on the unemployment rate. And so I thought, well, let me look across a whole bunch of different countries, and let's try and assess the strength of Okun's law across different countries. And that's what I've done here. And so this number on the y-axis is the Okun coefficient, which is beta, and that simply measures the strength of this relationship. So the higher up on the axis we are, the stronger the relationship. And you see that in Spain, if GDP changes by a little bit, there's a very big effect on what happens to the unemployment rate. But in Japan and Austria, there's almost no relationship. And now I'm not the first person to notice this. In fact, this is something which has actually caused the IMF quite a bit of consternation. According to the IMF, many countries have idiosyncratic features that influence this coefficient. These features, not one or two variables that we can measure for all countries, probably account for most of the variation. So what are these idiosyncratic features? Well, in Spain, it's the large number of temporary contracts, according to the IMF. In Japan, it's a tradition of lifetime employment, which makes firms very reluctant to let people go during a recession. And in Austria, well, they just have no idea. So what's the point of all this? Well, my point is that the dilemma of growth may not be as much of a dilemma as some people have suggested. That some countries have already managed to decouple growth from the unemployment rate, what's happening to the unemployment rate. And this doesn't mean that we should give up on working on ideas like working time reduction, a job guarantee, or the shift to lower productivity sectors of the economy. After all, we do need to try and understand what these idiosyncratic features are that have allowed some countries to defy Okun's law. In the end, though, these results may give some support to Blake Alcott's claim that ultimately society, not the economy, determines how many people are out of work. My second topic I want to talk to you about, money. We're economists, right? Let's talk about money. I was searching for an image that would sum up the current fractional reserve banking system that we have today and why it's so bad. And well, some of you have probably seen this before, but here it is. This was actually created by Jeremy Williams for the organization Positive Money. And he said, you guys are struggling with a very difficult issue here. Monetary reform is not sexy. You need something that's going to appeal to people. And what appeals to people more than pictures of cats doing silly things on the internet? But seriously, though, there's something very strange about our financial system and the way money is created. Most of our money is not created by the central bank or the mint, as most people suspect, but by commercial banks when they make loans. So how does this work? Well, let's say I go into a bank and I want to take out a mortgage. They look at me, they say, aha, he's friends with Giuseppe Fontana. He's just given a talk at ESEE2015. Sure, we'll give him a mortgage. Here's £1,000, 100,000 pounds. Now you'd figure that in order for the bank to loan me this money, they would actually have to have this money. or at least borrow it from someone else. But this is not how the system works. Banks are allowed to create this money and give it to me, loan it to me, because I promised that I'm going to pay it back. Now, if you don't believe me, and I admit this does sound pretty outrageous, then here it is, straight from the Bank of England. Banks do not act simply as intermediaries, lending out deposits that savers place with them. Whenever a bank makes a loan, it simultaneously creates a matching deposit in the borrower's bank account, thereby creating new money. So what could possibly go wrong with this, right? How could this be bad? Well, in the UK, the organization Positive Money has argued very, very strongly that this system causes a number of problems. And let me just give you a couple of them as an example. First of all, it provides quite a large hidden subsidy to the banking sector and a loss of potential revenue to the government. So whenever a loan is made, money is created, and when that loan is repaid, the original money which was created is destroyed, but the banks get to keep the interest on this, which is a pretty good deal if you think about it. At the same time, this also gives the banking system tremendous control over the shape of the UK economy. And so this graph here just shows basically the kinds of loans that have been made in recent years in the UK. And what we see here is that the majority of money which has been created and loaned has actually gone into mortgages and to other entities in the financial services industry. Only about 8% of money which has been created has gone into what we might call the productive economy, into business. Perhaps a bit worrying. So what's the alternative? Well, one alternative which has been suggested is to create a full reserve system or a sovereign money system, to prohibit banks from creating money out of thin air and to transfer this ability to a public institution such as the Bank of England, which would create the money, determine how much money was needed in the economy, and then transfer it to the government to spend into the economy. And in such a system, we'd still have private banks, but they'd only be allowed to loan existing money, which is how many people think the system works anyways. So why would we do this? Well, this has been a topic which has been of interest to ecological economists because there's been some arguments that this would help the environment. And here's a few of them. That it might help the environment in a sense because we would reduce the level of debt in the economy. They would elevate the environment in decision making by giving the state a larger role in the economy, and that it would eliminate a built-in growth imperative, a reason why the economy needs to grow. And it's this last one that I kind of want to talk about and discuss a bit with you. Is there a growth imperative in the economy? Why might we think there is? Well, as I said, if I go into the bank and I take out a loan, I have to pay that loan back, but I have to pay it back with interest. More money has to be paid back than was loaned out. And now if everyone is doing this in the economy, then it would kind of seem that the stock of money, the amount of money, would have to increase over time, which could result in this growth imperative. There are some reasons to be skeptical of this, though. This is an argument which many people, myself included, have made. We make this argument in Enough is Enough. The problem, though, is that the interest that's paid to banks is redistributed back into the economy as wages, dividends, interest to staff and shareholders, and so on. And perhaps even more importantly, the same stock of borrowed money that's created can flow back and forth many times within the economy. So the fundamental idea here really is that stocks are not the same thing as flows, and that we have perhaps been guilty of confusing these two things. Now, a model by Steve Keen, and more recently another one by Tim Jackson and Peter Victor, has shown that it's possible for households and businesses to repay their debts without the money supply or the level of economic activity needing to increase. So is that it then? Is that done and dusted? We've addressed this issue. Well, this may still not be the end of the story. There may be other growth dynamics attached to the current banking system. And I just want to touch quickly on three, which Beth Stratford has suggested. The first of these is that bank lending inflates asset prices, which very likely increases inequality. And none of the models that I've seen that I've looked at so far have included asset price inflation. And this may create another type of growth dynamic within the economy. So again, I think this is something we really need to look at. People who have large debts also tend to have to work harder to pay these debts off. And this is certainly contrary to the goal of working time reduction, which is one of the ideas put forward for achieving a steady state economy or for degrowth. And finally, banks tend to lend too much when the economy is growing and not enough when it isn't. And this makes recessions worse than they would be otherwise, which may be something that gives the whole idea, the whole project of degrowth or a steady state economy a bad name at the end of the day. So the upshot of this is that I think more research is still needed to really answer this growth imperative question. And again, I think this is an area where it's really good to see ecological economists and other heterodox economists working together to try and sort out some of these issues. Unfortunately, of course, we're having a debate tomorrow on this very issue in the morning, and so maybe we'll get it all sorted out then, right? Okay. Progress. Currently, we rely on GDP, which, as we know, is not a good measure of progress. It doesn't distinguish between good and bad economic activity. The cleanup cost for the BP disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, it's been estimated that this cost over $40 billion to clean up. According to the Wall Street Journal, though, this actually boosted US GDP. Although 3,000 jobs were lost in the moratorium on oil exploration, 4,000 jobs were created cleaning up the mess. We came out ahead. We need new measures of progress. I believe we should replace GDP with two sets of accounts. Measures of human well-being, such as health, happiness, employment, equality. These are the sorts of things we want to increase. And measures of resource use, such as material flows and CO2 emissions. These are the things that we want to decrease and keep within ecological limits. Now, I should say that a steady state economy is not an economy where the goal is zero growth in GDP. It's an economy where what happens to GDP no longer matters. So along the lines of new measures of progress, I've developed what I call the degrowth accounts. And this is a set of 16 biophysical and social indicators. The biophysical indicators are based on Herman Daly's definition of a steady state economy, whereas the social indicators are based on stated goals of the degrowth movement. All of the indicators are organized in a framework which goes from ends to means. And as you can see, there's a wide range of indicators from things like material and energy use right up to human well-being. Now, I've analyzed these indicators for 180 countries over a 10-year time period. And what I find, perhaps not too surprisingly, is that the vast majority of countries in the world are biophysical growth economies. There are a small number of countries which have managed to stabilize their resource use. Japan and Switzerland are good examples. In general, though, the countries that have stabilized their resource use have done so at a level which is too high to be sustainable. In other words, degrowth is needed before these countries can achieve a steady state economy. There are really no countries that achieve complete biophysical stability at a level which we might call sustainable. Cuba and Colombia probably come closest to this idea. Where these results become most interesting, though, is when we compare the social performance to biophysical resource use. So here are the results for two of the social indicators, self-reported well-being and health, as compared to one of the biophysical indicators, which is the ecological footprint. And the footprint here is compared to a sustainable level. And so really the sustainable level is at this level here, 1. We see, when we look at these indicators, that there does appear to be a relationship here, but it's a relationship with diminishing returns, which is probably good for sustainability because it means that there's a turning point where additional resource use is not leading to additional social performance. The problem, though, is that if we look at what's the level associated with a good level of performance, a 7 out of 10 on life satisfaction or 70 healthy life years, what we find is that in general, that level is 3 to 4 times the sustainable level. So a worrying finding for sustainability. However, there's quite a bit of scatter in this chart. Quite a few different countries. And in general, there's at least one country for each of the different social indicators which manages to achieve a high level of social performance at a level which is environmentally sustainable. The catch is that it's never the same country, depending on the different social indicator. Now, one of the things that explains some of the scatter in these graphs is growth. I'm going to show you something a bit different here. Now, here's what I've done is I've put countries into four groups, rather. Degrowth, stable, low growth, and high growth, depending on how they do on the different biophysical indicators. And I've then looked across these different groups how they do on the different social indicators. And what emerges from this is that, in general, it's the countries which have stabilized their resource use which do best on these indicators, even after controlling for the level of resource use. Countries with stable resource use tend to have higher human well-being, longer life expectancies, stronger democratic institutions. They tend to be more equal societies with less poverty. Oddly, it doesn't seem to matter whether a country is degrowing or growing in terms of its resource use, its stability, which is important. And when I saw this, this caused me to ask myself a question which I periodically ask myself, and that is, what would Adam Smith say? Because this is really not what Adam Smith thought, is it? He said, it deserves to be remarked, perhaps, that it is in the progressive state, while the society is advancing to the further acquisition, rather than when it has acquired its full complement of riches, that the condition of the laboring poor, of the great body of the people, seems to be the happiest and the most comfortable. He's a very good writer, isn't he? It is hard in the stationary and miserable in the declining state. The progressive state is in reality the cheerful and the hearty state to all the different orders of the society. The stationary is dull, the declining melancholy. Sorry, Argos. This, of course, is not what I find, right? I find that the stationary state looks like it can be quite a happy and a comfortable place, provided it's at a level where people's basic needs are met. Okay, this brings me on to my final topic, which is politics. Are the changes needed to achieve a steady state economy, are these ever really likely to happen? After all, if GDP isn't growing by 2 or 3% a year, then politicians start to panic, like this guy here. Now, I'm an economist, not a politician, and it's certainly been my belief that if we can show that a steady state economy is possible, economically speaking, then surely that makes it more politically realizable. But maybe I'm just a starry-eyed academic. There does seem to be some evidence to suggest that this is occurring, though. Since the global financial crisis, there have been 2 growth and transition events in Austria with involvement from, I believe, 5 different government ministries. The French government sponsored an event in the National Assembly in 2013 that brought together mainstream economists and politicians with more radical economists such as myself. The Prime Minister of Iceland recently commissioned a report on monetary reform, which was written by an Icelandic MP and which concluded, or at least suggested, a sovereign money system for Iceland and more work on that. And there have now been 3 Rethinking Economics conferences in London. The last one was just last weekend. At the same time, of course, there's a degrowth movement emerging from the bottom up. The first degrowth conference was held in 2008 in Paris. About 100 people attended. The second one was held in Barcelona in 2010. The weather was better. There were maybe 300 people there. The third one was held in 2012 in Venice. I didn't get to go, unfortunately, so I don't know what the weather was like, but I'm told there were about 900 people there. And the most recent one was last year in Leipzig in Germany, and there were over 3,000 people there. So if you do the math, you see that at each conference there's been 3 times as many people as at the one before it, which means that degrowth is growing exponentially. Now, I did a quick calculation this morning, and I concluded that if this continues at this rate, every single person on the planet will be working on degrowth by 2042, including the politicians, so maybe there's hope for us still. If we're serious, though, about achieving systemic change, then we need to do more. It's important that the microphone works. It's important that we keep developing the new economics. This is very important. There's still many questions that we need to answer. But this on its own will not be enough. I don't think that rational arguments are going to win the day. We need to move beyond this. We need to engage people at an emotional level in the transition to a new economy. And to do that, I believe we need to establish a shared vision of what the economy should deliver. Now, I use the word vision here rather than narrative. because I don't think narrative goes far enough. This vision needs to be positive, not some vision of an eco-dictatorship and freezing in the dark, but a hopeful transition towards a better place. Something along the lines of sustainable and equitable human well-being. We also need to be building partnerships, first of all with other heterodox economists, but also with NGOs, business leaders, civil servants, and journalists. And while we are building up the new economics, we also need to be taking down the old one. We need to discredit the current economic narrative. We need to show where it is false, that austerity is needed. We need to show where it fails to deliver on its promises, like green growth. And we need to show where it contradicts our values, like greed is good. We need to confront the power of the vested interests that would oppose these changes. And one of the problems that we face is that inequality is self-perpetuating. Testing, okay. As some people, let's call them the top 1%, accumulate more and more income and wealth, they also accumulate more power. And this creates a bias in policy, as these people are then more able to lobby against the kinds of changes that would lead to a sustainable economy. And so we really need to work against this. And this is one of the reasons why we need reforms like a citizen's income and a maximum income. These are important not just to limit economic inequality, but to weaken the power of vested interests. And how do we do this? Well, some ideas: strengthening democracy, both in the workplace and through electoral reform. Campaigning to move financial investments away from the vested interests that would oppose these changes. The fossil fuel divestment campaign is a very good example. And encouraging solidarity among the 99% of people who would benefit from these changes. Okay, nearing the end of my time here, and so I'd just like to end with a story and a demonstration. About a month ago, I was invited to speak, rather unexpectedly, at the European Central Bank. Now, I was warned in the invitation that the European Central Bank, and here's the wording of it, was very much hoping to recreate growth, but would nevertheless be interested in my ideas on how to manage a steady-state economy. Now, the ECB is a big organization. There's over 6,000 people working there, and it actually houses a real range of perspectives. Many of these are never publicly voiced, though, because it's quite a top-down autocratic organization. And I gave a talk on steady-state economics with a particular focus on monetary reform. And interestingly, what most people wanted to discuss at the end of my talk was actually planetary boundaries and decoupling, not monetary reform. They seem to say, oh yeah, there's a growth imperative. Yeah, we know that. But what about this decoupling stuff? Now, when I was leaving, I was given a very thoughtful gift. And I'd like to share it with you. It's a wine glass. And now, I'm going to fill this glass up. And we as a group are going to decide when it's full enough, when I should stop, when we have enough of this unusual liquid in the glass. Okay, so we're all pretty thirsty here, so let's get started. Let's start. Is that enough? No? Okay. How about now? No, more, okay. More, I still hear more. All right, here we go. Whoa, what's happening? We've seemed to have passed some sort of tipping point that we didn't quite see coming. Some kind of non-linear change. This is what's called a Pythagorean glass, or a greedy glass. As long as you don't put too much liquid into it, it's a perfectly normal glass which you can drink out of. But as soon as you go beyond the point of enough, it spills all of its contents onto the floor of the Rupert Beckett Lecture Theatre. And if we're not careful, we're in danger of making the same mistake with the global economy. At the moment, we're making decisions based on whether they're good for growth or good for productivity, not whether they're good for people or the planet. We've forgotten that growth is just one means to an end and not an end in itself. But once we let go of our obsession with GDP, then we can focus on what really matters, the health of our societies and the ecosystems that contain them. Imagine an economy founded on fairness. Imagine an economy that uses resources wisely. Imagine taking action to begin the transformation. One thing is for certain, change will only happen when we recognize that enough is enough. Thank you.